We're going to continue in our series looking at the book of Proverbs, and as I've said a number of weeks, Proverbs is one of those books that I love because it really kind of cuts to the chase. It really kind of gets to the point and lays out in real practical ways one of the great realities as to various ways that we can live all of life with God. And kind of our summary verse, our foundational verse has been the Proverbs 3:6 of in all of our ways, how do we acknowledge God? So how do we practically, in everything that we do, acknowledge God's presence in the midst of life? Because sometimes one of the dangers is we can kind of segregate or we can kind of section off parts of our life, and some areas, are God's allowed in, and in other areas He's not. And what we're really wanting to do is simply say, okay, how do we change the conversation so that life suddenly becomes everything lived with God? And so every week we've been kind of practically breaking that down, looking sometimes at what are the barriers in life that can sometimes prevent us from experiencing God. Like last week we looked at self-control. 2 weeks ago we looked at the area of anger. How can anger be one of those powerful emotional responses that can actually be an indicator for something that God wants to identify is going wrong in our life? And so the next number of weeks, we're going to look at more and more practical things, such as how do we include God into our family or into my workplace, wherever that may be? How do I include God in my decisions, in my finances, in trying to figure out what exactly I'm doing in life? And so we want to kind of break it down every week. And this week, I found myself reading through Proverbs and noticing again that so often what Proverbs does is it continues to come back at the same themes in different ways. So there's rarely kind of a huge chunk that is devoted, but rather a verse will pop up and then another verse pops out. And what you start to realize is how Proverbs really is a book written by individuals looking back on life and what it means to truly be wise and live life with God. And so this week I was thinking, when we think of our prayer life, is there such thing as a bad prayer? If prayer, if I understand it correctly, is our conversation with God, is there an inappropriate conversation? Is there like a worst prayer ever? Any David Letterman fans out there? You can admit it. None. Okay, there. Thank you. Some honesty. I appreciate that. Well, David Letterman, one of his signature moves is he has a top 10 list. I'm pretty sure a top 10 list he's never had are our worst prayers ever. But is there such a thing? I was thinking this week, and we posted on Facebook, and I got a few responses. One person wrote in, well, what about rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub? It's maybe not the most theologically reflective, but not necessarily a bad prayer. I was thinking a bad prayer this week are people who are continually praying for snow. Seriously, if you're praying for snow, stop. God has heard you enough. But what would be a worst prayer ever? What would make a top 10 list? I have a selfish prayer. What else? A groundhog prayer. There you go. Yeah, no kidding. The groundhog doesn't listen. What else? A bargain. What are some conversations that we start to think, wait a second here, is this really appropriate? What else? Noah praying for rain. Yeah. You start to look at some of these things, you start to realize, hey, wait a second here. How does this practically work out in my life? Well, I have something that I want to propose to you that I might identify as being the worst prayer ever. I'm going to invite Marie to come up and read it for us here this morning.
To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all that I get.
So that's going to be kind of the verse we're going to focus on here this morning. And if you want to follow along, it's in Luke 18, and it's on page 81 in one of the Pew Bibles here. So if you do want to kind of follow along, I'm going to be referring back to that, but I just thought I'd give you that opportunity. But again, if prayer is rightfully understood as being an intimate conversation or just simply a conversation with God, then why is this the worst prayer ever? Let me kind of frame it in a different way. Think of someone who is very important to you. Could be a spouse, it could be a parent, it could be a sibling, it could be a friend. Imagine I go to Rebecca one day, and this is my conversation with her. Rebecca, I have news for you. You are so lucky to be married to me. I cook every once in a while. I take out the garbage at least once a week. I earn money. I mean, look at this house that you live in. Could you ask for any more? And not only that, but you know what? If we're really calling a spade, look at Jim down the street. I'm way better than Jim. Or what about Doug over there? How well does that conversation go over? Not good. Not good. Or just think of any other conversation you find yourself in when you are having a conversation with someone and it seems as if the person consistently brings it back to them. You could be telling them about something that you have done, but they seem to have a story that is always better than yours. You talk about an accomplishment that you have had, and they always seem to one-up you yet again. It's almost as if in the conversation, you just feel like you should fall down and say, I am so grateful just to be in your presence today. Thank you that you consider me worthy to speak to you. And that's in many ways what is going on in this conversation, in this prayer between what Jesus is referring to as a Pharisee, which is a religious leader at the time. You see, this is a perfect example of one of the greatest dangers in life that can cause such destruction, not only in our relationship with God, but in our relationship with others. The two things that God cherishes most in this world is our relationship with Him and then our relationship with everyone else. And that's why C.S. Lewis, the great author who wrote the Narnia series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in one of his books, Mere Christianity, says, pride is the greatest sin. When compared to any other, everything else is like a mere flea bite in comparison to the destruction of pride. Proverbs has much to say about the issue of pride. In Proverbs 16:5, it says, the Lord detests all the proud of heart. Proverbs 6:16, the Lord hates haughty eyes. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before the fall. Pride is one of those areas in life that repulses us when we see it in others. Yet if I'm being honest, it is such an issue that we constantly have to wrestle with. Because pride is so destructive, yet so subtle at the same time. Because what pride can do is it takes the good things that God has given to us, the desirable things that we want, the areas in life that we are good and successful in, and begins to twist it in such a way that suddenly life no longer becomes about our relationship with God and our relationship with others. It becomes all about me. And suddenly the gifts that God gives to us are not given as a way so that we can then serve and minister to others. They become a means of serving ourselves. And not only that, the gifts that God gives to us are now no longer a way for us to give thanks to God, but a way again of just simply serving our own needs and our own desires. It can creep into so many things. It can creep into family life. It can creep into work. It can creep into appearance. And in this case, we see it as well creeping into the area of our own relationship with God. One of the great dangers that we face is when pride begins to overtake. Pride suddenly becomes a means of us self-identifying. And that's why Jesus so often comes after what we'd refer to as the Pharisees. You know, if you read through the New Testament, anytime you see Jesus trying to make a point negatively against someone else's actions, it's often towards the Pharisees, the religious elite, the religious leaders. And sometimes we can read through the Bible and we can kind of dismiss it and think, oh yeah, the Pharisees, boo, hiss, I won't be like them. But to understand the context, the Pharisees strike pretty close to home. They're a devoted group of followers of God that actually began in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So at the end of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, beginning in the New Testament, Matthew, there is 400 years, kind of referred to as the silent years. And there was a group of devoted Jews who said, listen, we are getting off the rails here. We are failing to follow God the way that He has designed and outlined for us to live. So what do we got to do? We got to get back to the Bible. We have to live in such a way that people actually notice a difference of God in our lives. We feel so passionate about God that we actually want to go and plant other synagogues. Because for a lot of people, if you're living on the outskirts and you can't get to Jerusalem, these religious folks say, that's not cool. We'll make a synagogue in your little village, in your little town, so that you can worship God as well. Incredible heart. Incredible intentions. But then over time, it got twisted and twisted and twisted. When suddenly they replaced a relationship with a functional religion. By markers by which they could identify, more importantly to others, how good they were with God. And we see it right here in this prayer. When this Pharisee stands out in front of people and says, hey God, I fast, I tithe, I'm not like this other guy. And I love how Jesus sets it up. He says, there was a man, he says, speaking to those who were confident in their own righteousness. It's a term that Jesus was using to describe people who were prideful in their relationship with God because they felt as if they had these external markers and they found pride in that. You see, pride really becomes destructive because pride takes the place of God in our life. We suddenly, when pushed to a certain place, the Pharisees had no need for Jesus. They had no time for Jesus because they felt as if they had it all figured out on their own. And that is the destructive yet subtle nature of pride. Is it moves us further and further and further away from God. Whereas if you continue reading in Luke 18, there's a second man who's identified as a tax collector. Jesus is using that marker not to kind of out the guy, but to kind of, again, speak to the religious folk of the day and say, here's a tax collector, someone that you would look down upon because they don't have the external markers of a religious person. And the guy doesn't even raise his head. He just takes the posture of humility and says, God, have mercy on me. The Pharisee had no need for God. The tax collector realized and recognized he was nothing without him. And that's the real danger of pride. Of we begin living life as if, you know what, God is more of an accessory, that we don't really need him in life. We can kind of figure it out on our own. You see, it's important for us to understand that pride is not thinking less of yourself. Pride is not being a person of humility is not saying, well, you know what, I'm just going to go around as if, I have no significance or no worth. No, we take pleasure in the good things in life. We take pleasure in our success. We work hard with the gifts that God has given to us, but our success, our pleasure do not become the markers of our identity. Because whatever defines us is what we will pursue with the greatest amount of passion. And so for faith, if we keep it in that realm, if what defines us is how the external markers of faith can be seen by others, then guess what? Instead of pursuing God, we may think we're pursuing God, we're actually pursuing these markers. You see, we can say he's important to us, but is he really? But there's a second aspect to why pride becomes so destructive. Because not only does pride make us compete with God, it forces us to compete with everybody else. When we struggle with pride, we know we have an issue when suddenly it's a game of comparison. And it goes one of two ways. Either I'm better than that person, so we look down on them, or we look at someone else who may be in a better place than us, and instead of being able to rejoice with them, there's a side order of envy that comes along. You see, one of the dangers of pride is that of entitlement. I deserve this. Why don't I have that? You see, C.S. Lewis goes on to say that pride gets no pleasure in having something. It only gets pleasure in having more of it than the next person. You see, pride can never be satisfied because as soon as you have something, there's no pleasure in that. You suddenly notice that someone has more than you, and so you now go after that. And it becomes more and more competitive, and it just continues to grow and grow and grow when suddenly it not only destroys our relationship with God, it begins to destroy our relationship with everyone else. And suddenly your pleasure is not simply in success, it's in being better than others. It's always the scale that we use. Well, I'm better than so-and-so. Or look what they did. It becomes this place of constant comparison. Which is why Jesus so often went after the Pharisees. Because he wanted others to see that this is not what God delights in. That God delights in people who are willing to celebrate and enjoy life, but with a sense of humility, in understanding that their identity is in something greater. Their identity is in Jesus himself. You see, what's amazing is just how people, so often the non-religious, were drawn to Jesus in droves. Because they saw someone who lived with such humility. I'm sure we see it in life. If we're being honest, we see it in ourselves because it creeps in subtle ways. So this morning, just as we kind of conclude, I want to look real practically at some things that I have found helpful in my own life to help me use as indicators of when pride begins to creep in and help me to become more humble in the midst of life. Because this is an area of challenge. This is an area of concern in my own life. And so one of the indicators that I use, one of the antidotes to pride, to fight it off, is that of gratitude. I ask myself the question, how grateful am I in the midst of life. And my gratitude goes beyond just simply the circumstances or the situations, because that can come and that can go. But overall, what is my perspective in life? Because with pride comes entitlement. With pride comes a lack of satisfaction, of always wanting more. So the question is how grateful am I in the midst of life? And my gratitude has to go beyond just simply the circumstances, but rather in what Jesus has done, in who Jesus is, and how Jesus views me. You see, one of the areas that I struggle with is I'm a people pleaser. Right? And so when you're a people pleaser, you say things and you do things so that people will appreciate you, people will say nice things to you. And so one of the things I have to do in life is to realize, hey, wait a second, is my identity, is my confidence based upon just simply the things that people say about me? Or is it truly rooted in the reality of how God views me, of how God loves me? And so one of the key indicators in life for me is how grateful am I in life? Because that's a game changer. The second thing is to become a person who I would refer to as lies in the weeds. What I mean by that is, in Matthew 23, Jesus is hanging out with his disciples. And the Pharisees again go by. And Jesus says, you know what? Don't be like those guys. Because they always want to be recognized with special titles, special clothes, special seats of honor. They want people to know what they're like. Someone who lies in the weeds, lay in the weeds, is someone who doesn't need to simply throw themselves out there all the time. It's not always about titles. It's not always about recognition. It's not always about telling someone else about just simply how important you are, but rather just taking a step back and not getting bent out of shape when someone doesn't recognize an accomplishment you may have done. But even more than that, willing to push someone else into the spotlight so that they can be appreciated by others. If you're constantly competing to be noticed by others, it's one of the indicators that something is going on. It means I begin to take myself a little less seriously. I often tell people I take Jesus very seriously, myself not as much. Which means you're able to joke, you're able to laugh, you're able to admit when you have messed up. The third thing that I do is I don't close my notebook or my iPad. I don't have an iPad, so I don't close that. But if you have an iPad, and what I mean by that is do you have a teachable spirit? Because one of the things that I've learned is that when I fail to learn from circumstances or from others, it's often because pride has crept in. It's often because I think, you know what, I have figured this out. I don't need to learn from others. And then when I do mess up, I either try to cover it up or defend it or push the blame somewhere else. As opposed to saying, no, I'm going to own this. I'm going to recognize that God can and will use this. Not only to deepen me, but perhaps to figure out a better situation. And then the fourth area is that of confession. In this example that Jesus used in Luke 18, he says, here's a man who was confident in his own righteousness and looked down upon others. You see, pride breeds a judgmental attitude because one of the ways that we feel better about ourselves is by pointing out the issues in other people's lives. And one of the ways that you start to suddenly become less judgmental is just to recognize, as Jesus says, you know what? Don't worry so much about the speck of dust in other people's eyes. What about that big, massive, honking log that you're walking around, that everyone but you notices? You know, when you take a look in, you start to realize, hey, you know what? God is still at work in my life. And what it means is that you don't not address issues in other people's lives, because that's not the way of Jesus either. But you don't address issues in other people's lives to simply make yourself feel better. You do it to see them grow into the person that God desires them to be. You know, as I think about the Pharisees, I think of how close to home they cut. I begin to realize one of the greatest, not one of the greatest mistake that they committed was the fact that they failed to see Jesus. Jesus gave them chance after chance after chance. He continually spoke to them. He continually told parables trying to identify in them this issue of pride. But because of pride, they not only failed to have loving relationships with others, they missed the Savior of the world. I think in many ways, the first way that we acknowledge God in everything is by perhaps admitting that we have issues with pride. Because when we don't, we suddenly begin to go down the path of thinking we can figure this out on our own, and like the Pharisees, we miss Jesus. I find it striking that Jesus so often continued to come back to them, which truly shows that he had a heart for them. He had a desire that they would see the error of their ways and just again give their lives over to them. And so as I think of my own life, as I think of my own situation, the greatest mistake that I will make in life is by thinking that I have it so put together that I miss the very presence of Jesus and his desire to live all of life with me. So perhaps this week, this is one of those conversations that makes us squirm a little bit. And you've all been very polite. But take some time. Begin to reflect upon your life and to say, in what ways am I missing you, Jesus? Because I have been so consumed with myself that I fail to see you and I fail to see others through you. That's what I love about a life lived with Jesus, is it's a continual journey, a continual learning process. As we not only learn more about him, but we learn more about ourselves and the life he desires us to live. But it begins by being like that other guy that simply comes to Jesus and say, hey, I don't have it all figured out. I need you. I need you. Please stand as we sing together.